For the past 10 years, the Louis Burke Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College has presented free talks for the public by best-selling authors and great thinkers on the college's Upper East Side campus. This unique opportunity to meet exceptional individuals in an intimate setting with light refreshments has drawn guests from within and beyond New York City.
Hi, did you enjoy it?
Those of you who are writers know what I'm talking about. You have a little voice in your head, drives you crazy.
We're dancing with words, prancing with words.
As a result of the 2020 coronavirus pandemic and required social distancing, public gatherings such as our remaining 2 talks for the spring semester have unfortunately been canceled.
That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank goodness we've recorded it.
Center Director Louis Frumkes has had each of the talks recorded for archives and to provide a copy of the talk to the speaker on DVD. The lectures were not intended to be made available online.
We have some incredible scientists coming.
That the universe just began.
Given the need for intellectual stimulation during this troubling time, the Frumkes Center is making many of our past talks available to view for a limited time each week, starting with the first recorded talk featuring Howard Gardner back in April of 2011, running through our most recent talk on March 9th, 2020 with Meg Wolitzer. Stay tuned to our website for more information about the videos available each week.
I am told that the president is in town, unfortunately not to hear Howard, but to tie up traffic. So I was asked to wait a few minutes and let people get here. They may be late, but I see our seats are almost filled anyway. My name is Louis Frumkes. I'm director of the New Writing Center through Continuing Education at Hunter College. I'm delighted to see you all here. We've had a fairly successful best-selling author series so far, and Jane Smiley will be here in May, and Freeman Dyson, in our great thinkers of our time, will be here next Wednesday. He's an iconic figure in physics and mathematics from the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. And then on June 4th, we put, this is our first, the brochures are being printed, but this is a flyer to tell you, if any of you are interested in writing, that we are having our first annual Hunter Writers Conference, Saturday, June 4th, and there are 12 panels on fiction, nonfiction, memoir, literary agenting, everything you could want to know about writing, and keynote speakers and networking receptions, and it's quite a thrilling thing. And if you are interested in hearing more about it, follow us online, or you may get a brochure in the mail, or you can inquire at Continuing Education, and you can find out more about it. Saturday, June 4th, the writers. It's going to be very special. Nelson DeMille and Walter Mosley are the keynotes, but we also have some spectacular other writers that are listed. You'll see some of them listed here, but on every panel there will be amazing people. Tonight is very special because a special night is made special by special speakers and special guests, and this is one of the best. As long as I have known Howard Gardner, and that must be 20 or 30 years, he has been a cognitive scientist of the first order, and also an educator extraordinaire. In his new book, Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Reframed, about which he will speak tonight, and I'm the bearer of sad news. He told me to nicely let you know that he's not planning to talk about multiple intelligences, at least not in his formal talk. Maybe you can tease it out of him in a Q&A. Howard elucidates the state in which these virtues are currently held and teaches us how to educate for them throughout life, in and out of the classroom, for now and for the indeterminate future. Lest any of you have misplaced some of your multiple intelligences, let me remind you that Howard Gardner is the John H. and Elizabeth A. Hobbs Professor of Cognition and Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and Senior Director of Harvard's Project Zero. The recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship and 27 honorary degrees, he is the author of more than 20 books, including Multiple Intelligences, Changing Minds, Intelligence Reframed, 5 Minds for the Future, and the new book. It always gives me great pleasure to introduce Howard Gardner, and tonight I am especially happy to welcome him here as part of our Great Thinkers series at Hunter College. Howard Gardner.
Thanks, Louis. Louis is a very special human being, and I feel grateful that I've known him, as he said, for a long time. And in addition to being a wonderful writer and humorist and person, he also is somebody who makes things happen. And the list of people and events that he chronicled is very impressive. Present company, of course. I won't, it's not for me to say, but I'm very glad that he's here at Hunter and putting together such wonderful programs for all of you. I could indeed talk about multiple intelligences in my sleep, but it might put all of you to sleep. And so I am taking advantage of this podium and making you into guinea pigs. And the reason I say guinea pigs is this book, of which there are 3 copies back, has not yet been published yet, and this is the first time that I've spoken about it publicly. So that's the good news and the bad news. I don't know what it's going to sound like, but you certainly heard it first here. Excuse me. We all use the words true, beautiful, and good every day, and we use them unreflectively, and for the most part, we get away with it. Excuse me. And I got away with it when I wrote a book somewhat over 10 years ago called The Disciplined Mind, in which I argued the purpose of education was to help people know what's true and not true, what's beautiful and not beautiful, and what's good and not good. And if you want to follow the argument, go look at the book called The Disciplined Mind. That book was very naive. And I learned how naive it was when people asked me questions that I couldn't answer, and when I watched my kids and my students in the ensuing decade. And the reason the book was naive is because it ignored 2 things which are very powerful. One is the postmodern critique, which says, who are you to say what's true? Truth is just about power. Beauty, it's an old-fashioned word, has no meaning anymore. And good is completely culturally relative. You know, what's good for us may not be good for the bongo or vice versa. And if you hung around the university, you've heard these kinds of postmodern critiques. The other thing is the digital world, the digital media. You know, you look something up on Wikipedia, you may think it's true. Tomorrow the opposite's there. Is that true? Works of art are created, changed, morphed, posted, unposted, taken from all over the world, in all ways, shapes, and forms. How do you decide what's beautiful in the digital world? And then the digital world is the Wild West. It's a place without norms of good and bad. You can take any identity you want on Facebook. You can download and circulate anything, whether it's permitted or not. And perhaps the most interesting thing about the digital world is once you leave a digital trace, whether you're 5 years old or 50 or 500, you never know for sure what's going to happen to it. You were participating in a community of undefined temporal or spatial limits. And the question then is, how do you behave in that community when you don't know what's going to happen to the bits that you've created? Anyway, a few years ago, I had the opportunity at the Museum of Modern Art here in New York to give a set of lectures, and the lectures had a somewhat more truthful title than the book, but I got to have the title for the lectures, not for the book. The title of the lectures were The True, the Beautiful, and the Good, Reconsiderations in a Postmodern Digital Era. And in those lectures, I talked about the ways in which you have to re-examine truth, beauty, and goodness in terms of what postmodernists say when they challenge these concepts, and the state of flux which exists in a constantly changing, constantly morphing digital world. And I had fun giving those lectures, but I was also doing a test, namely, is there a book in those lectures? And rightly or wrongly, I came to the conclusion that lectures are evanescent, books are forever, though print books may not be, but digitally forever. So that's the book. I don't typically read when I give talks, but I'm going to read from the preface to the book, and then I'm going to conclude with a few paragraphs from the end of the book, because the preface very dramatically introduces the problematic of the book. Prop number 1, this is as close as we get to PowerPoint. This is a book called The Education of Henry Adams. In 1904, Henry Adams, notable historian and member of arguably the most distinguished family in American history, he was an Adams, published privately a lengthy essay called, and you'll hear I don't have a French, I have no French ability, Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres, a study of 13th century unity. Henry Adams felt inadequate to deal with the many transformations that had taken place since his birth in 1838. The growth of cities, the rise of mass transportation, the influx of immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. He couldn't deal with the world of 1900. So what did he do? In this essay, he described life in France in the 11th and 12th century as an ideal. The ideal was most faithfully captured by the magnificent Gothic cathedrals, awe-inspiring buildings where individuals of various backgrounds and classes gathered to worship, to behold splendid works of art, to hear magnificent chorale works, and to be spiritually uplifted. These cathedrals testified to a precious unity in life. The church, the cathedral, represented a world to which all should inspire because that world was true, directed by the Word of God. It was beautiful, a magnificent construction, made by man in the image of God, and it was good. With the inspiring light of the church and the examples of Christ and of the saints, people could and would live a good life. So I use this Henry Adams book as a symbol of the time when people actually believed, if Henry Adams is right, that truth and beauty and goodness could be as clear as that church on Chartres or Mont Saint-Michel. And he even goes on to say literally, the Mount expressed the unity of church and state, God and man, peace and war, life and death, good and bad. It solved the whole problem of the universe. One looks back on it all as a picture, a symbol of unity, an assertion of God and man in a bolder, stronger, closer union than ever was expressed before. So that's Henry Adams, Truth, Beauty, and Goodness, no problem at all. Here's a book, and it's probably never been put in the same hand as Henry Adams, Reality Hunger, a manifesto. How many of you have heard of this book? Okay, not very many. Nearly a century later, in 2010, so you see I'm up to date, novelist turned essayist David Shields published a book entitled Reality Hunger, a Manifesto. This book's harder to describe than Adams's. It consists of 26 chapters, each identified by an alphabet letter, A to Z, and a pithy title, but the book actually consists of 618 squibs, things which could be a few lines to a page. And he covers all sorts of things in these squibs. What makes the book unique is that nearly all of it consists of quotations from other writers. The careful or informed reader gradually infers that much of the text comes from others, but in most cases, when he uses the word I or we, it's not clear who's talking. Only at the end of the book does Shields, who calls himself the author, state what he has done and why, and then reluctantly, at the advice of lawyers at Random House, he supplies dozens and dozens of footnotes indicating the sources of nearly all of the quotations. So this is a book, 200 pages, and you have no idea how much he wrote or you assume he wrote the whole thing until you realize this doesn't sound like him. And then if you get to the end of the book, you see that it's all quotations. By this time, readers like me have become suspicious. If we've been led along a deceptive path for 200 pages, why should we suddenly believe the author? And indeed, nearly all of the quotations call into question what truth is, whether it can be achieved, whether it matters. So let me just give you 4 quotations. Number 1, and if you're at all in the world of blogs and digerati, this will sound very familiar. Number 1, the lifespan of a fact is shrinking. I don't think there's time to save it. Number 2, all the best stories are true. Number 3, something can be true and untrue at the same time. Number 4, this gives me particular shivers. It's difficult to separate what happened from what seemed to happen. So I'm impelled to revisit Shields' book in light of the trinity that inspired Henry Adams. As a student of reality, I have to ask, what, if anything, in Shields' book is true? As a student of morality, I have to say, is it good to publish a book that is actually a string of quotations initially unacknowledged as such? And as a student of the arts, I have to say, is this beautiful? The 2 books and the 2 authors exemplify the problematic of the book, of the present book. No longer, if ever, can we accept such terms as truth, beauty, and goodness without scrutiny, if not skepticism. And yet, is there anybody in this room who wants to get rid of them forever and never have the words truth, beauty, and goodness? So that's what I try to do in the book. So what does Gardner conclude in the end? I'm still looking for the soundbite that's going to get me on the radio, but Lewis actually interviewed me already, so I've had a start there. But what I'm going to do is talk about 3 things. 1, the conclusions I actually come to about truth, beauty, and goodness. 2, who are the bad guys? Who are the whipping posts in the book? And number 3, what are the educational implications of my analysis? And then I'm going to read the concluding paragraphs of the book, and that should take another 15 minutes or so. First of all, truth is about propositions. It's about things that are asserted. And my belief is that actually it's easier now than ever before to figure out what's true and what's not, as long as we're willing to work at it. And that's because almost everything that anybody asserts, you can get lots of evidence for and against. And if you approach these assertions in a disciplined way, and discipline means either through academic disciplines, like history or science, or through professional disciplines, like journalism or law, you can actually figure out what the state of affairs is better than ever before. So the one-liner is, going forward, if you're willing to work at it, the pursuit of truth is convergent. That means we can get closer and closer to the actual state of affairs. So that's, on my argument, good news. Beauty, the classical notions of what's beautiful and what's not are gone, and they're never going to return in my view. Instead, what we now have is what the French writer André Malraux calls a museum without walls. And we can have exposure to every work of art ever produced, and of course to any part of nature, either in person or via graphic imagery. And what that means, and it's really quite wonderful, is that each of us can develop our own conceptions of what's beautiful, and we don't have to accept a canon from anybody else. I don't know whether there was ever a real consensus a la Henry Adams about what was beautiful, but there are now so many works of art and so many views of nature that the notion that there ever could be a convergence anymore is over. But I think the divergence is actually a quite wonderful thing. I develop in the book, and I think this is probably the most controversial part of the book, my new dispensation of beauty. And I consider beauty as an adjective which we apply to experiences which are interesting, memorable in form, worth revisiting, and, this is done with a bit of a wink, producing a personal tingle. So beauty is no longer the golden mean, it's no longer the savannas of East Africa, or a Persian miniature, or a Greek vase, unless you find those objects interesting, memorable in form, and worth a revisit, and when you revisit, it feels good. So that's beauty, divergent. Ultimately, I argue everybody will develop their own sense of beauty, and that's wonderful, because it doesn't impinge on anybody else's. Goodness. Truth is about propositions. Beauty is about experience. Goodness is about relationships among human beings, how people relate to one another. And I develop a distinction in this book, which I believe in and am willing to argue for. Is the distinction between what I call neighborly morality and the ethics of roles. Now, I spent 50 pages on this, so I can't do justice in a few minutes, but I'm going to try to capture the essence. Neighborly morality is the way we deal with people who hang around us, who live on our street, in our neighborhood. And neighborly morality hasn't changed in thousands of years. The Ten Commandments, the Golden Rule, is about how we relate to people whom we see all the time. If you remember the Ten Commandments, you don't steal, you don't commit adultery, you don't murder, you honor your parents. That hasn't changed. What's new are the roles that we play, particularly the roles of worker and the roles of citizen. Now you may say, well, people have always worked and they've always been citizens, but I say no. Because when everybody did the same thing, whether everybody was a hunter or gatherer, or everybody was a fisherman, that was just part of life. But now we each have particular professional roles. We're teachers or doctors or lawyers or architects or engineers, and each of those spheres has its own ethics. And those ethics have to be developed fairly recently based on what it is that journalists or lawyers or teachers do. It's not something that is part of our DNA, so to speak. Also, while people have always been members of communities, the notion of a citizen, being a citizen of New York City, New York State, United States, and the world, because we're citizens of the world, these are new notions. They actually, we can trace their history in times much too short for them to be part of evolution. So the argument here is, while going all the way back to prehistoric times, what it meant to be good to other people around you was the same as it is now. What it means to be good as a worker in a profession, or what it means to be good as a citizen of various entities, is something which has to be negotiated in real time. The idea I develop at the conclusion of my discussion of goodness is that people who are children of the Enlightenment, which probably everybody in this room is, have a certain view of what it means to be good. And it means that you believe in progress, it means you believe in rationality, it means you believe in transparency, and that's fine. But the view of Enlightenment, the view I've just described, the Enlightenment view, was really developed by a few men living in France and England and Scotland a few centuries ago. There's nothing wrong with that view, but there are other great cultures and civilizations, big and small, that have developed other values which they consider to be as important for Enlightenment purposes. And we cannot live in a world where each of those societies has a notion of goodness which clashes too much with notions of goodness in other societies. So that's really the project of the 21st century. And I think science and medicine probably serve as the easiest models, because we don't have different science and medicine in different parts of the world. When you're thinking, well, what about folk medicine or traditional herbal medicine? Those may exist side by side with science-based medicine. But as I was joking to Lewis earlier, every time a dictator in the world anywhere gets sick, they don't go to the local herbal thing, they fly to London to have surgery there or to get medicine. So basically there's a convergence in science and medicine, but for there to be a convergence in other spheres of work and other spheres of civics is a huge job, but I think it's the job of our time. So truth is about propositions, and the chances of figuring out what's really going on is greater than ever. Beauty is about experiences. Let everybody define their own beauty, and that's great. Goodness is about relations. How we relate to people near us hasn't changed much, but how we relate in our roles as worker and citizens is a huge project. The book has two bad guys, and I'm just going to mention what they are because they may step on a few of your toes. On the other hand, if you agree they're bad guys, you can get some evidence here. One bad guy is evolutionary psychology, namely that we can explain everything about human beings just through our evolutionary history. I don't think that's true. And when I read the last paragraphs, you'll see why. The other is economics, particularly market economics, rational choice, the notion that all human behavior ought to be governed by market forces and that people make rational decisions based on the markets. That's the other bad guy, but that's for extra credit. I'm not going to talk more about that today. So many of us are in education. How do we think about education for the virtues in the 21st century? That's the second half of the book. First of all, I see education as being lifelong. I think anybody who isn't senile will continue to grapple with these issues of truth and beauty and goodness as long as they're alive, and that's good. That's not bad. It used to be that education probably ended at age 12, and my parents' and grandparents' age maybe at 20, but now it continues throughout life, and figuring out what's true and how you know about it, developing your own sense of beauty, figuring out how to relate to other people, that's something which continues lifelong, and I think that's great. For truth, that's really the job of formal education. I don't think people can understand how we make judgments of truth unless they've learned about mathematics, history, science, and so on. And then I talk equally about what I call practical truths, the truths that govern how a journalist operates, how a lawyer operates, how a doctor operates, and that truth can't be learned unless you are inducted into a profession. So truth is really the job of education as we know it. You could ask me how much can be done by distance learning, but I won't talk about that now. Beauty, formal education is fine for beauty, but to me, the way we educate people in the sphere of beauty is by simply exposing them to many, many experiences in the arts and in nature. And here's the crucial move, asking people to indicate the differences they see between one work and another, between one slice of nature and the other. Because I don't care which you think is good and which you think is beautiful and which you think is not. I care that you can see the difference or hear the difference, whether it's to works of music or dance. If you can discern the difference, that's the most important thing. If you can't discern the difference, then you can't enter the game. But which you decide ultimately you value aesthetically, that should be up to you. And I developed in the book the notion of a personal portfolio. And this portfolio can be in your head, it can be physical, or it can be in your computer. But the portfolio is the works that you valued over your life. And almost anybody with any senses, this kind of senses, will know that what we like when we attend is not like what we liked when we were 20 or when we were 40. Our aesthetic sense changes. And the more that you're exposed to things, the more that you engage to see differences, the more wonderful it is. So the notion of a personal portfolio, which you develop on the basis of experiences, where you make discriminations, where you say what it is that you value, and you can change that, that's to me is the divergence of beauty. How about goodness in relations? There, I think, there are really two things that are very important. One are role models, positive as well as negative. You're not going to learn how to be a good worker or a bad worker. You're not going to learn how to be a good citizen or a bad citizen unless you see others around you, typically older, but they could be peers. They could even be younger. I sometimes learn from younger people. As the older I get, the more I learn from younger, because everybody is. But these are sorts of things which I think almost have to be done face to face. There's only a limited amount that you can learn about relations just by reading about them or by identifying paragons. And then, and this is where our own work has been focused in the last 15 years, dealing with complicated ethical issues, figuring out what the different perspectives are, trying something out yourself, reflecting on it. If it doesn't work, and often it doesn't work, what could you have done differently? And you might call this kind of an ethical portfolio, but whereas the beauty portfolio can be highly individualized, society doesn't work if your moral or your ethical portfolio is too idiosyncratic. In fact, we call that psychopathology. We have developed something called the Good Work Toolkit. It's a website called goodworktoolkit.org. I have no PowerPoint slides, happily, but that's what the PowerPoint slide would say, where we have discussions of ethical issues that arise at work. In fact, I made a contribution today on that website. So the latter part of the book discusses how we can develop and then continue to hone our own senses of truth, beauty, and goodness through formal education, informal education, exposure, and reflection on our own experiences. I said I was going to conclude about now by reading the final paragraphs of the book, and what I say is always true. I try to be truthful. Okay. As this inquiry draws to a close, I'd like to offer two observations. Though they pull in different directions, they're equally crucial. First, the role of chance, fate, vagaries will be important, perhaps decisive. In all matters involving humans, the shake of the dice matters, and often profoundly so. We can hardly conceive of the physical and biological worlds if the 25-year-old Albert Einstein had not worked in a patent office, or if the 25-year-old Charles Darwin had not traveled on the Beagle. And yet, despite the power of Einstein's physics and Darwin's biology, neither of their disciplines has been as important for our inquiry as the forces of history, the influence of history and histories, which in turn are studied with chance occurrences. How can we possibly anticipate the effects, positive, negative, unanticipated, of artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, genetic manipulation, global warming, and the possible convergence of human neural networks and computer neural networks into an unprecedented singularity? I apologize because these are references to things that are elsewhere in the book, but the notion is lots of life is unpredictable, chancy, and that's why neither evolutionary psychology nor rational choice economics is going to tell us what's going to happen. My other observation, despite the role of contingency in human affairs, individuals do matter. Leaders, those who work with them to help achieve their mutual aspirations, those who seek courageously or destructively to undermine the leader's mission. The efforts and choices made by individual people can play a decisive role in the fate of mankind. Thanks to Galileo, we have an altered understanding of the truths governing our physical environment. And he was a brave guy. Thanks to James Watson and Francis Crick, we've gained an enhanced understanding of the natural world. Thanks to painter and sculptor Michelangelo, we have a richer notion of beauty. Thanks to dancer Martha Graham, we have an expanded notion of what counts as beautiful. Thanks to Gandhi and the founding figures of our major religious and philosophical traditions, we have a fuller sense of the good person, the good action, the good life. Last paragraph. We cannot all achieve these pinnacles, these models of creators and ethical people, but we need not go gently into the dark night. Our choices need not be dictated by our own genes or by the impersonal features of supply and demand. We can all assemble around a campfire, a conference table, or a website and participate in lively conversations about the virtues. We can go further, drawing on centuries of scholarly and practical knowledge. We can sift through the morass of information and move steadily toward the establishment of truths. That's my convergence. Starting early, contemplating the range of artistic and natural creations, We can assemble a portfolio of beautiful objects and experiences, perhaps fashion our own product, our own objects of beauty, and arrive at our individualized aesthetic sensibility. As for morality and ethics, we should honor neighborly morality and respect the conventions of diverse cultures. But at the same time, we should strive to become good workers and good citizens, not just within our own society, but across the global community. Our actions should transcend self-interest. In so doing, we can provide powerful models that inspire our fellow human beings to act in responsible, indeed, in ever more responsible ways. And if you would turn the page, you would see acknowledgments, notes, and an index. So, that's the book. I hope that you found this interesting enough to pursue it further. I see Louis walking up to me. Okay. Anyway, the floor is open for questions. Do we have a mic here, or?
We do.
We do. Okay.
I believe we do, and I'll spot for you.
Okay, great.
Who would like to start? The gentleman right over here.
In the very beginning, you mentioned the word power and how it distorts truth. But then you sort of didn't get back to it and started, talking about truth as, as it was completely independent of power. And here we are, and we have whole bunches of powerful people trying to distort the truth around global warming. We have, the popes trying to distort the truth around a heliocentric universe and putting people in prison.
Not this pope.
No, but at one point in time, and that pope was power.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off here because
Yeah.
I think I get the thrust of your question,
So
and I will answer. Sure.
How do you?
I think the answer is actually around us every day. When there is control of information, then truth becomes power. But let's just look at what's happened because of the digital media in the Middle East. It's no longer possible in the long run to quash things. And so that's what I mean by a better chance of truth emerging. Not easy. And my reference to the professions is very important in this regard because there are different conceptions of journalism. And those conceptions of journalism will compete with one another. But my belief is that ones which attempt to get it right will ultimately prevail among ones that distort information. Is it a guarantee? No. But I think that the digital media, Twitter, Facebook, etc., make the possibility of a permanent domination of truth by one party unlikely. On the subject of global warming, that's really an issue of journalism, and I'll tell you why. There is a notion in many places that when 5,000 people tell you one thing and 3 people tell you the other, you give them equal time. That, to my mind, is the distorted notion of the job of journalism. But certainly, for certain periods, things which I would consider nonsense, like the critique of global warming as having either no reality or no human input, will be overwhelmed by the many sources of information pointing in another direction. In the time of Galileo and the Pope, Galileo could have gotten killed. That's why I said he was courageous. I think time's on our side. But thank you for the question. And thank you for letting me cut you off because I didn't want to give others a chance.
Gentleman here.
Yeah.
Hi. I'd like to ask what led you to wanting to explore the 3 issues that you dealt with in your book?
You mean truth, beauty, and goodness?
Yes.
Well, I think we'd have to go back to why I wrote The Disciplined Mind. And I'm not a terrific historian of myself, but I developed the ideas of multiple intelligences many years ago, and that was kind of my 15 minutes of fame. And those ideas were used in education, even though I hadn't particularly developed them as an educator. And so kind of after the fact, we're talking about the middle 80s to middle 90s, I began to think, well, I should know something about education. I'm a teacher and have been in the business for a while. What do I really think the purpose of education should be? And to talk about truth, beauty, and goodness wasn't terribly original, but it was in my own reflections on education, particularly pre-collegiate education, that I thought the most important things to be accomplished in pre-collegiate education was the 4 topics that I mentioned in passing: understanding of history, science, mathematics, and the arts. And so I said, those are the tools that human beings have developed over a long period of time, over thousands of years, which represent our best efforts to figure out what's true and what's not, mathematical, scientific, historical truth, what's beautiful and not, etc. What I did in the book was to show how you could approach truth, beauty, and goodness using the multiple intelligences. That's chapters 7 through 9 of the book, but that's for extra credit. I won't go into the detail now. And I thought I'd accomplished something in the book, but as I said, for the next 10 years, people were raising the kind of question that gentleman did. You know, how can you talk about truth so naively? And so I'm trying to de-naive it, whatever the word is, try to ask hard questions of myself. And the real goal of this book, I mean, it would be completely unrealistic to say I've solved issues of what truth, beauty, and goodness are. I'm not a fool. But what I'm trying to do in this book is to say, hey, if you live in this era with the postmodern critique on the one hand and the digital media on the other, and if you want to talk seriously about truth, beauty, and goodness, you've got to deal with those issues. And so I'm trying to get a discussion going, because we don't want to have a situation where teachers and parents naively think that they know what truth, beauty, and goodness is, and then kids go on the internet or kids run into a postmodern seducer and they think this is all nonsense. At least that's not what I want. Mike. You thought I knew your name, right? I'm not a psychic, no. Yeah.
Something I don't think this microphone's on anyway, but something I've been trying to, your theory is
I can hear you, but they can't in the back.
Okay. Your theory has had a huge impact on me and my career. And something I've been trying to wrestle in my own research is how you delineate and how you separate, how you choose what is an intelligence and where the line stops between intelligence and a talent and a there's a very, what is the line that you use where you say, okay, intelligence has stopped here, and then in thinking of these 2 extra things, I can see easily where truth fits into your model of multiple intelligences. I mean, I think a lot of IQ researchers would argue that propositional thought and all that is measured well in IQ tests. Beauty is not measured well in IQ tests, and I don't think goodness is measured at all in IQ tests. But do you see a role for beauty and truth in a theory of intelligence?
I get the thrust of your question. Now, obviously, I could talk for 3 weeks about this, but then I'm going to keep it to 3 minutes. Number one, I'm very interested in the issue of intelligences, but there are many things which intelligence as a term doesn't cover, and they could be equally important: will, attention, memory. I'm interested in basically computing power. My theory claims we have 8 or 9 relatively independent computers. I call those the intelligences. I have a set of criteria. I'm not going to run through them, but there are 8 criteria. They're listed in Chapter 4 of Frames of Mind. There's some copies back there, and they come from a number of different disciplines. People are welcome to use those criteria themselves, and there's some candidate intelligences which I think are plausible, but in my day job, I don't worry about that too much anymore. Relating to goodness, I've maintained for a long time that the intelligences are amoral. Both Goethe and Goebbels were very good with the German language. They had linguistically intelligence. Goethe wrote great poetry. Goebbels generated hatred. The way you use the intelligence is good or bad, but the intelligence itself is amoral. On the issue of talent, I believe intelligences, people can be talented in any intelligence. But when people say, well, music's a talent, I say, fine, but why should we call people who are good with sounds and rhythm and melody talented, whereas people who are good with words smart? And no one's ever given me a good answer to that. So I don't accept the difference between talent and intelligences. I could go on, but probably I want to give other folks a chance to ask questions.
Are we all done here? Going once?
No, let's...
No, I'm kidding.
I believe in wait time.
Who else has a question?
There's one back there, yeah. And by the way, I also answer questions from non-males.
On the question of economics, I would agree that we wouldn't want to make every decision in life based on economic utility, but as a predictive science, what else would you suggest? I mean, are you talking about throwing out economics as a honorable profession?
Okay, and a person asked about evolutionary psychology. Well, let me start with that because it's an easier one for me to ask. There's a new field called neuroaesthetics, which tries to explain our sense of beauty by what we know about the brain. And I do a real hatchet job on that. What I say is basically, brain tells us everything about our taste except what's interesting about it, which is that it changes and evolves, and that basically what evolutionary psychology tells us is what's kitsch. Namely, when you first begin to look at the world, you like to look at beautiful water and trees, but anybody who keeps looking at the world develops much more sophisticated notions. My worry with economics is the notion that somehow people are basically on the earth to pursue their self-interest, and that if they do that, good things will happen. I don't believe that for a second. I think it's a very pernicious view. And when I talk about the role of chance and the role of human agency, I think those are precisely the things which go against pursuing the self-interest, but makes human beings and human life worth living. This is obviously something I have a passion about. But I think if we talk about economics as a predictive science, on the one hand, we have its failure to predict the events of the last decade, quite beautifully failing to predict it. And then we have the abuse of economics, as in the movie Inside Job, which probably many people have seen here, which I would like to at least knock economics down a few pegs. But certainly, there's lots to be learned from macroeconomics and microeconomics. I make use of them. There's a lot to be learned from evolutionary psychology as well. Certainly, our sexual behavior is well explained by that. What I'm talking about is when these disciplines get too big for their britches. But obviously, people from those fields will disagree, and that will make a discussion.
Yes, the young lady with the blue and green.
Wait, would you wait for the mic? Thanks.
Hello. Do you think common sense is more important than intellectual intelligence, or however you want to label it?
Actually, my answer isn't going to make you too happy, because I have a couple of sentences in the book where I say common sense is often common nonsense. But it was being somewhat more seriously, thinking in a disciplined way, and by this I don't mean just working hard, but thinking historically, scientifically, even aesthetically, are not natural ways of thinking. They're ways of thinking that have been developed by human beings over a long period of time, and they go against common sense. Common sense says the world's flat. Common sense says, well, it snowed this year, so what's this nonsense about global warming? And we develop science and history and mathematics and art forms to go beyond common sense. But let me give you a non-truth, beauty, and goodness answer to the question. I don't believe that common sense is a coherent category, because I think people can be very sensible in one sphere of their life and not sensible in other spheres of their life. So let me give you the example of the car mechanic and the social problem solver. You go to the car mechanic and he listens to you for a few minutes, and you say, oh, and he tells you what's wrong, and you say he's got tremendous common sense. On the other hand, when there's an argument going on in his shop, he makes it much worse by screaming rather than saying, wait a second. Similarly, a person comes into the shop, doesn't have a clue about how to fix the car, but when the Donnybrook breaks out, can do a very good job of lowering the temperature. This is a complicated way of saying common sense is quite domain specific. And I don't believe that you run into people who have tremendous common sense across the board. People develop common sense for areas where they have some experience. But did you have something else in mind? Because I'm able to scrutinize the puzzled look in your face.
No, I'm just concentrating on you. But I mean, what is your definition of common sense?
I would say that
What is the definition?
Yeah, I would say that common sense is a well-developed intuition in a sphere without necessarily being able to explain why it is that you're doing it. I don't think anybody's born with common sense, but if you've done a lot of work in any area and you kind of are awake, you'll eventually develop a sense of how to do it. So nobody's born knowing how to negotiate difficult financial problems or how to negotiate difficult interpersonal problems. But if you're involved a lot and you reflect on it, you probably get to be good at it, right?
We had the lady here with the red hair.
Thank you. Getting back to truth, what about personal truth, such as I'm thinking of the movie Rashomon, if you remember it, where everybody had a different version of what happened?
It's a good question. One of the fun things about first starting to talk about a book is the questions are new. If it was multiple intelligence, are there differences between men and women? If you look different, I've heard all the questions before. This is a question. It's almost a psychoanalytic question, you know. I think when it comes to knowing the truth about yourself, that's really hard, because since you have privileged information, and all people can do is to try to hone in closer to that information. So I guess in thinking aloud about it, I would say, first of all, there's a question, do you want to know the truth about yourself? Many of us are very smart. We don't want to know the truth about ourselves, and that's a way of getting through life. But I suppose, pursuing the argument of the book, we have more data available now than ever before. Let's just take me as a teacher. And what I'm telling you now is the gospel truth. Since we're talking about truth, I have never gone to look at what it says about me on Rate My Professor, because I don't want to know. I'm interested in what my students think, and I read their thing, but I have no interest in what people who don't know me think about me, because it's prejudice. It could be positive or negative kind of prejudice. But clearly, in the digital world, anybody who's at all well known can have much more information about how they seem than they ever would before. And the people who I value the most in this regard about my work are my wife, my kids, and a few close colleagues who will actually tell me when this is crap and when's not. I don't need people either to say everything is crap, which isn't helpful, or to say it's good just because they want to curry favor. So I think that you can do better, but it's not science, because ultimately there's a phenomenological aspect which nobody else can have access to. Are you in the therapy or that?
She's a hypnotist.
A hypnotist. Now you see, that's why I watched her. Okay, well, offline you should tell me what you think, sir. Look, can you wait just for the mic? There's a question about common sense again.
When you talk about common sense, are you really talking about experience as you keep on moving along, and you catch on to these things and getting common sense?
Right. Do you have but if you have another thing in mind, tell me. How do you use the term?
I use the term based upon my experience. I've developed a lot of common sense in areas that I was involved with.
Right. I mean, I'm going to use an example at my wife's expense, because I love my wife. The other day I was driving with somebody in an unfamiliar terrain, and we went by a house kind of fast, and someone who looked kind of like a hillbilly, though this was in Massachusetts, got out and screamed, "You're driving so fast, don't you realize that?" And the guy who was driving me said, "I'm terribly sorry, thank you for telling me," and immediately lowered the temperature. And I quipped to him, and my wife laughed when I repeated it later. My wife would have screamed back at him. Now, they've both been in lots of altercations, but the common sense thing there is to lower the temperature, because there's nothing to be gained by screaming back. But nobody's born knowing how to behave in those situations. And that's why in the book I say a lot of stuff that we would call common sense is common nonsense, and a lot of education, formal and informal, is trying to help us to behave better in those circumstances. Talent or intelligence is the ability quickly to improve in those spheres. And those of us who are not very intelligent in those spheres, I mean, I'm in the Metropolitan Museum today, and I must have been there 200 times. I still get lost. I obviously don't have a lot of common sense spatially in the museum.
This lady, and then we have to go this one in the back with your hand way back.
Okay.
Next, and then we'll.
If you allow me, I want to ask you about intelligence. Just again, going back. I just want to know if you think, like, let's say, musical intelligence is with the same value as math intelligence in American society, in developed society. Because judging by the Regents exam, there's not that many music questions or art questions that you have to pass in order to be, to pass the, to grade.
Yeah, I think there's no question that, especially in the United States nowadays, there's a worship of what's called the STEM topics: science, technology, education, and math. And there's a devaluing of everything else from history to art. That's what caused Diane Ravitch to do a big turnaround. So I would be a fool if I said these things are valued equally by our education establishment, and indeed, it's one that cuts across party lines. That said, in the book, when I say, why beauty, I say once your basic needs are met, that's what life is about. And we crave experiences, whether they're with works of art or nature or with other people, which we would call beautiful, that make us, experiences that make us feel good. And you're absolutely right. It's not the case that everybody is going to be able to make a living as a musician, but next to my family, the most important thing in my life is music, and not to have access to that is tragic. But I can't change society. All I can do is hope that there'll be a space for people, whether or not they can make a living doing something, that at least they can get pleasure out of it. And the wonderful thing about the arts is there's no limits. I mean, everybody can do them. Everybody can have a portfolio. Everybody can create. And indeed, with the digital media now, you can go pretty quickly into doing fairly complicated things, which would have been inconceivable, even 15 years ago.
We'll take two more questions. The lady there, and then whoever else.
The hand.
Can you talk a little bit about what you see as the role of education in the creation of the arts?
You mean?
The creation, the writing of a book, the composing of a piece of music, the choreography of a dance. What role do you see as education having in that process?
Well, I don't know whether you're asking about formal or informal education. Formal, as I said to the last questioner, I think it's a tragedy that our current educational priorities in this country are so short-sighted, and other parts of the world are better, but the trends are in the same direction. I think it's very myopic, very regretful. I've worked for 44 years at a place called Project Zero, where our focus is on education of the arts. And I'm lucky enough to be able to give my children, and my grandchild is already learning how to play a keyboard instrument, arts education. But for many people in the world, as many people in this country, that's not possible anymore. I guess one of the things about the digital media is at least you can have exposure to art forms even if you don't have them in school. And as I just said to the previous questioner, you can do Guitar Hero, or you can do Photoshop, you can do things in the digital world, but ultimately every artist needs to have some kind of guidance, some kind of feedback. It can be done to some extent digitally, more than I would have thought, but it's still no substitute for somebody who knows you and cares about you and gives you the feedback that you need to have.
Okay, last question, the lady in the very back.
Hi. Okay. So when you develop theories such as multiple intelligences or start to explore things such as truth, beauty, and goodness, what is your goal, personally and professionally, and to your audience?
That's a great question. I'm basically a scholar and a researcher, and I study anything that I can study, either without funding if it doesn't require any funds, or if it requires funding, and a lot of my research involves other people, I have to raise money for it. But I only try to raise money for things which interest me. I'm not somebody who would apply for a grant if I wasn't interested in the topic. Some of the things I've written are written because somebody asked me to write about them. And actually some books of mine which have been quite successful were based on a suggestion that I write a book about a certain topic. This book is unique of all the books I've written, and as Lewis said, I've written too many books. Yeah. Now, a lot of my books have the word mind in it, and my kids are quipped I should write one called Never Mind. Yeah. This book is unique because this is a book I really wanted to write for myself, because I was really wrestling with these problems. I thought they were terribly important. I didn't think other people were paying enough attention to them. And so I really wanted to work it out for myself. Now, as I said, I don't think I've worked out the answers perfectly, but I like to believe that I've opened up questions which need to be discussed, certainly by everybody in education. We cannot afford to be naive about these things, given the very trenchant postmodern critiques on the one hand, and given the fact that the digital world, online learning, has just opened up all sorts of things which weren't thought of in a pre-digital era. So this is a book that really is a book I really wanted to write. I've joked, and now since the end of the evening I can joke, it's a book that nobody has been waiting to read. I mean, if I were to write a book, Multiple Intelligences and Sex, or a book to write Multiple Intelligences Refuted, you know, I would know that there are people waiting to read those books. Nobody's waiting to read this book, but what I'm hoping will happen, and I'll be very honest with you, this is the first time I've talked about it, is enough people will say, this is really an interesting and important question, and it's worth my thinking about it and my contributing to a discussion. That would make me very, very happy. And with that, I thank you for coming. There are some books back there I'm happy to sign, and if you want to slip a question in while I'm signing, I'll do my best to answer it.
Thank you.
Great.
And refreshments.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. Very gracious of you.
Full house.